This is the Dollemore Daily, and I'm Jesse Dollemore.
You may have noticed that the federal government has been passing around a lot of money lately. The CARES Act, signed into law last March, introduced $2.2 trillion into the United States economy. A second stimulus bill, this time $900 billion, was passed on December 27, 2020. That's over $3 trillion in just a few months. Now, after the House of Representatives votes on Tuesday, Joe Biden will sign the Democrats' stimulus package, which contains $1.9 trillion in federal aid to individuals, state and local governments, businesses, and more. And unless something remarkable happens in the House, it will have passed with zero Republican support. Not a single Republican senator voted to even slightly ease the deep and dark suffering of millions of Americans. Which leads us to a commonly asked question. Where does all that money come from? Before we try to answer that, though, let's take a stock of where we're at right now in America. The coronavirus pandemic has devastated lives, permanently disrupted families, and trashed the economy. According to one estimate, over 18 million people right now are currently out of work or not working as much as they'd like to, directly due to the pandemic. 54 million people in America are facing food insecurity. 54 million people, many of them children, are not getting enough to eat in America in 2021. According to a study done by Yelp, around 160,000 businesses closed between April and September of 2020. And upwards of 20 million Americans are a combined $70 billion behind on their rent and face eviction when temporary protections are lifted. The situation is grave, worse than the vast majority of us have ever experienced. But just because the situation is extremely bad doesn't mean we have the money to simply throw around like it grows on trees, right? How can we be so cash-strapped one minute and then suddenly spend $3 trillion in a space of a few weeks? Money that wasn't in the budget in the first place. Well, professional slow-motion talker Mitch McConnell stoked these exact fears on Friday, February 4th, after the Senate passed the budget plan on the $1.9 trillion stimulus package, 51-50, with Vice President Kamala Harris casting the tie-breaking vote. He said,
"The American people deserve for the conversation about the next steps to begin with them and their needs, not partisan rush jobs, not talking points. It will not serve Americans to pile another huge mountain of debt on our grandkids for policies that even liberal economists say are poorly targeted to current needs."
McConnell is not only wrong about piling on another huge mountain of debt on our grandkids, liberal economists are not saying this policy is poorly targeted. On top of that, as Biden himself said in a clever rejoinder, it seems Republicans are just rediscovering their fear of the national deficit, which rose by $1 trillion or more every single year during the Trump administration due to his irresponsible and massive tax cuts. And it isn't just under these extraordinary circumstances that these concerns arise. Every time a politician talks about new policies to improve the lives of average Americans, we hear that familiar refrain. How are we going to pay for it? Healthcare, education, jobs, Social Security. The question is always, how are we going to pay for it? Or what about the deficit? For regular people at home worrying about their own finances, the concern is a natural one. We all worry about the bottom line in our personal finances. At the end of the day, the budget has to balance, right? But here's the reality. The United States government doesn't have to find the money. Conventional wisdom says that we all have to balance the budget because, of course, we all do, right? Well, not Uncle Sam. And this is tough to get our heads around because most of us think about the United States government like we think about our households or businesses. Most politicians, economists, and pundits, they do this too. There is this kind of common sense to it, it seems. We know how household economics work. We know how our businesses run. If we spend more than we take in, we are headed for financial disaster, insolvency, bankruptcy. We have to balance our budget, live within our means. We might get away with borrowing some money to make a major purchase like a house or a car, but even then we have to factor in the monthly payments on that debt with all our other expenses and make sure we have the income to cover it. There are hard limits in that respect. But this is not how the United States Treasury works. The U.S. Treasury is the holder of a very special power, the power of the purse. The U.S. government is the issuer of the currency. They create the money. In a very real sense, we can't get any money for ourselves or our families until the government first spends it into existence. The U.S. Treasury always has more money because they're the ones who issue it. Ever since we decoupled the dollar from the gold standard in 1933, the United States has had what's called fiat currency, meaning it's backed by the government, not by any other specific asset like gold. And in the way our monetary system is set up, the United States Treasury can spend any amount authorized by Congress. They never run out of money. The U.S. government can never go broke. So when we face a major crisis like the one we're currently in, Uncle Sam just spends money. And I know what you're likely thinking. What about inflation, you simple ginger pumpkin-headed freak show? And that's a reasonable question. But the United States has experienced anomalous periods of inflation, most recently in the 1970s. So yes, there are limits. The government just can't spend money with wild-eyed abandon. If the Treasury injects too much money into the economy, the value of each dollar goes down. Or, to put it in another way, the price of stuff goes up. That's inflation, and it can be as devastating to the country as a depression. But it's also not true that inflation is waiting in the shadows to devour us all. It's not like Donald Trump bellying up to a table getting ready to crush a dozen Big Macs. And like I said, we haven't seen damaging rates of inflation for like 45 years. It was only 12 years ago that we faced the last Great Recession. The crisis 12 years ago, though, was entirely caused by the actions of a specific group of people who were gaming the system. Greedy Wall Street speculators who were essentially betting against the housing market. It's one thing to short sell a retail outlet like GameStop. It's something else entirely to short a market that's central to the well-being and survival of nearly every American: housing. So we've been here before. We know what it's like to face an economic crisis of a truly global scale. And we've seen these enormous stimulus packages enacted. In 2009, just after his inauguration, Barack Obama signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, a $787 billion spending bill designed to save the United States from a depression. This amount was much less than many economists thought it should be to stave off a long recession. The Obama administration played it cautious, even at $787 billion, though. Even so, there were fears, and not just about inflation, but about hyperinflation. But it didn't happen. Why? Because the economy was that depressed. There was room to introduce that new money and debt buybacks. Inflation wasn't the result in 2009, and it's not going to be the result in our current crisis. Republicans and Democrats alike, but let's be honest, mostly Republicans, are always worried about the cost of all the spending. Curiously, though, it's a concern that never comes up when lawmakers are expanding the military, passing a big fat tax cut for the richest Americans, or writing the tax code so almost 100 of our biggest, most profitable companies end up paying zero in taxes year after year. And it's not just about massive stimulus packages either. Anytime a progressive politician makes an argument for a bold new policy like forgiving student debt, universal health care, or infrastructure spending, politicians, the media, and all of us at home are conditioned to immediately ask, how will we pay for it? During the Democrats' primaries this year, Pete Buttigieg was a frequent critic of Senator Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All policy, arguing, you guessed it, how will he pay for it? Mayor Secretary of Transportation Buttigieg said, call me simplistic, but I think when you put forward a plan, you ought to put forward how to pay for it too. But Petey knows better. Mayor Secretary of Transportation Pete knew better when he said it. We've already seen that the government doesn't need our money to pay for things. They only need the votes of Congress. Once they have that, they can spend as much as they need. Our nation faces several serious challenges at this very moment, including a rapidly worsening climate crisis, runaway wealth and income inequality, and the erosion of our democratic institutions, just to name a few. It will take the best and brightest among us to overcome these challenges, but the one thing we shouldn't be worried about is the money. Our goal is not to balance the budget as if the United States were a household. Rather, the goal is to solve our many problems while controlling for inflation, something that we have done many times in the past and can easily do again. If only we'd stop letting timid, simpleton politicians scare us with images of red ink on our household budgets.